Hi, everybody. Welcome to Humanities Cafe. My name is Stacy. I am the program coordinator here at the Humanities Council, and I'm glad you could join us today. We got some interesting stuff to talk about today. If there's one thing we always tend to talk about in the Midwest, it's the weather, right? It's not the heat, it's the humidity. It's not the snow, it's the wind chill. Never a dull weather moment in South Dakota. But it turns out that Laura Ingalls Wilder, who lived in our area in the late 1800s, talked about the weather too, a lot actually. And there's a great deal we can learn from her about the weather, about the climate, and about our own efforts to protect what we hold most dear to us. Joining us today to tell us all about what we can learn from her is meteorologist and climatologist Dr. Barb Boustead. She and her book, Wilder Weather, will be featured at the upcoming Festival of Books, and we are delighted to have her with us today to give us an inside track on what we can and should learn about the importance of weather and climate from Laura Ingalls Wilder. Barb, thanks for joining us. Please tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, and what you do.
Thank you so much for having me. I am Barbara Boustead, and Barb is a good name to call me when we're in conversation. And I am a meteorologist and climatologist, as you said. I have written this book after, a good 15 years or so of research looking into weather and climate in Laura Ingalls Wilder's books, and not just the sort of historical deep dive into what happened and the fun history, but also how that compares to our modern climate and how we can learn from what Laura did and communicate using Laura as a common interest so that we can have more conversations about weather and climate. I live in the Omaha area and I'm from Michigan originally, so I am a Midwest and Plains girl here at heart. And I live here with my family. And I am really excited to be here. Thank you.
I'm so glad you could join us. So, you mentioned that you're both a meteorologist and a climatologist. Tell us a little bit about what those roles entail.
Both of those roles involve studying the atmosphere and the interplay with the oceans, the land, and the rest of our Earth system to understand the weather elements we may experience. The differences are slight, and they're mostly in timescales and some techniques. Weather is generally looking in the very near term, out to maybe a week or so. What we consider climate could be looking past, present, or future. As it turns out, climatologists may look back at historical data to understand the climate of the past. They may be looking in the future to understand how climate is changing or not changing. And they also can look at the present to see what bigger parts of the Earth's system are influencing the weather conditions that we experience. So it's a little bit like two specialties of medicine. The anatomy, the fundamental parts of what we do in the physics are all common, but the specialties are just a little different.
Okay. So, how did you become interested? At what age and how did you become interested in studying the weather or becoming a meteorologist or climatologist?
If you ask any meteorologist that question, most of them have one of two answers. Either they experienced some kind of really sort of foundational weather event or season, some really big winter, a tornado perhaps, and
Mhm.
they get interested because of that and how it sparks their curiosity, or they were afraid of weather and learned more about it to overcome a fear. And I'm in that second camp. I was afraid of weather as a very young child. My mom took me to the library to get me books about the weather so that I could learn about it and be a little less afraid. And I loved it. I read every book I could, and the passion was born. I told her in first grade that I wanted to be a meteorologist.
Well, so you mentioned books. What inspired you then to write this book?
I had been working on just dabbling at the research of Laura Ingalls Wilder and her weather, and really particularly, I had been looking at the long winter. I
Mhm.
had the opportunity to present that at a conference called Laura Palooza, which sounds funny, very serious conference. It's an academic conference of folks who study different aspects of Laura Ingalls Wilder's experience, or those who are near to her. And I received really good feedback and curiosity from the attendees at that conference, um, that what I told them about the weather that I knew at the time sparked more questions, more curiosity from them. And I really felt like there was a more compelling story to keep digging into and keep sharing. So it was really early in this research that, I thought maybe someday I'd write a book about it. And over time, because I am not a full-time writer, I have a full-time job. So bit by bit, I plugged away at that book and got it finished and out to the world.
Well, and it is a good book, and it's got a really nice cover. I have to tell you, I love
Mm.
the cover. So let's dig into the basics. First of all, what's the difference between weather and climate, and why does it matter? I know that you have an analogy related to baseball, and I really like that analogy. So could you share that with us?
I will. So, I am a sports fan as well. Something about statistics with weather and climate and statistics of sports goes together really well. And so, the analogy I like to use for those of you who are baseball fans or maybe baseball parents or grandparents is that the weather is like a single at bat, right? And climate is more like a batting average. So, if you're in a situation where you really need to get a hit and you've got a 300 batter who can come in and pinch hit, or you've got a 200 batter up at the plate, you might be putting in that 300 batter because they've got a better chance of getting a hit. It doesn't guarantee that they will. They can also strike out, get walked, or have a number of other outcomes. But the odds are better. And we know that because of how they have hit through time. You can even look back at their stats, maybe just for the last year or over the last, 5 years or their whole career. Climate and weather have much of the same relationship. Weather events are that single at bat. And over time, you get a feeling of the history and patterns that emerge. And that's, the batting average, that's the climate. And as with baseball, there are things that can influence that batting average, like, for instance, the steroids era, um,
Too
where
soon.
uh, what happens in the atmosphere with carbon dioxide is a little bit like steroids for weather. It influences that batting average too.
I absolutely love that analogy. It made things make sense a little bit easier. So when we're talking about things like a lengthy heat outbreak or a flood season or like this summer when it's rain, 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 where does weather leave off and climate begin? Or is it a combination of both?
They interplay with each other. Every weather event that happens goes into the climate history, becomes part of the range of possibilities, the range of experiences in a place, and into the averages over time. So, climate is a collection of all of these events over time. And similarly, climate, the way things maybe are changing or certain patterns that set up in a season, then can influence individual weather events. Climate doesn't necessarily become a sole cause of any one event. For instance, although temperatures may be warming, that doesn't mean every day is warm or that the temperature is always above average. Um, it just influences over time that more of them are above normal than they used to be, or that, this decade is warmer than 5 decades ago. So we look at how they interplay with each other. And, when you get into the world of weather, there's like a hard stopping point that like 7 days is weather, and anything past that is either a shorter range climate or longer term climate. The reality is it's more of a spectrum than a hard cutoff.
So weather affects climate, but does climate affect weather?
Yes, absolutely. Yep. And it can be things like climate change and trends. It can also be more of the seasonal parts of climate. So, for instance, you may have heard of El Nino and La Nina. These are patterns that can set up based on ocean temperatures in the equatorial Pacific Ocean, long ways from here, but has a lot of influence on jet stream patterns over North America. So, El Nino and La Nina can influence our weather too. And, it's never the case that just one thing is the cause of our weather. There's an interplay of a lot of these patterns that are seasonal and go back and forth. There's the interplay with climate change. And there's also just the randomness of weather. Sometimes, the butterfly flaps its wings. There's a chaos theory out there that, small changes can end up being a big difference in what ultimately evolves. And that is a part of it too, this chaos and randomness in the system.
So how long does it take then to develop what we consider a climate history? How long of a time span?
Um, the more the better is always a good answer. If the World Meteorological Organization has defined 30 years as the minimum to establish a formal scientific climatology, the number 30 is the magic number because a lot of statistics rely on having a sample of at least 30 members to calculate the averages properly. But in truth, sometimes it takes more than that to really understand the range of possibilities. And sometimes you can get a sense of some trends and patterns or ranges of possibilities in a shorter time span too. But in general, I think if you're trying to figure out the weather history of a location, it's good to have a few decades on hand. If you're trying to project in the future, you can look ahead a decade or 100 years and try to get a sense of the possibilities.
So how are climate change predictions determined then, especially now with um, the human impact on our climate as as the years have gone on, with all of those changes and all the human effects on the on climate? How do you predict it?
That is an interesting question, and I love this question because a lot of people don't realize that the most unpredictable, most difficult part of figuring out how climate is going to behave in the next, say, 5, 10, 100 years isn't necessarily the science side. We have a pretty good understanding of how the carbon dioxide composition in the atmosphere influences temperatures. It's really more the human side because it is really difficult to predict how humans will change or not change what they do. The scenarios that are put forward in climate models are based on different pathways or possibilities that range from, tomorrow, every country on the planet decides that they're going to curb emissions 100% and stop burning fossil fuels, all the way out to nobody changes anything. In fact, we keep on increasing that output even more than where it is now. Um, there are some possibilities that are certainly more likely than others, and those become the ones that emerge as sort of our best guess. But, the range of possibilities from zero action to, immediate cooperative action is pretty wide.
So on a hypothetical, say that tomorrow everybody 100% across the board stop emissions. How then what role do you have then? Like where's the first step you take? And okay, this is now gonna have to shift here. How do how does that impact what you do?
So what that would impact is how we would communicate what's possible in the future. If we had a pathway that became more clear than others, we can lean more toward that prediction. And if everybody cut everything off today, we still have some change baked into the system, so to speak, because there is still that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and it takes a long time for it to work its way back out again. So we would slow the rate of change with that kind of action and be able to demonstrate how that change is slowing down to, give some positive reinforcement that the actions are working. Um, but it would still take time. It would not be instantaneously
Right.
returning to how things were before the industrial era.
Okay. I should have mentioned at the top of the show, and I didn't, and I apologize. This is an interactive show. So if you have a question for Barb, you go ahead, raise your hand. If you don't feel like you want to go on camera or want to use your voice, go ahead and drop a question in the chat. So at this point, does anybody have any questions or anything for Barb? Don't be shy. Nobody? Okay. Well, we're going to shift a little bit then. We're going to start talking about weather in history. And this is like where Laura comes in because wow, did your book so good. So weather plays a role in every single one of the Little House books. It's like a character in the Little House books. But in what ways? Is it a background character? Is it a main character? What are some examples of the weather as a character?
So for those on the call, I assume at least some of you have read some of Laura Ingalls Wilder's books. Maybe some of you haven't read them in a long time or didn't read them all. Um, in some books, weather is an episode or maybe, a setting description. But there are books of Laura Ingalls Wilder's that are predominantly focused on the weather. The Long Winter is, of course, the biggest example of this. And truly, the winter is the antagonist in The Long Winter. It is what they are battling throughout the entire book. But it isn't the only one, even still. For those who have read On the Banks of Plum Creek, grasshopper weather is a big part of the story, a big component of how the family navigates their finances and ultimately their choices in where they live later. It is true now that weather can shape what we do, where we live, what we're affected by, and in some cases, even our income. Um, but it is also the case that in Laura's time, they were especially vulnerable to those conditions that truly, if they didn't pay attention to the weather, it could put not just their livelihoods, but their lives at stake. Um, but that is true of us too. If we aren't paying attention to the weather, we also can be in danger or have our livelihoods impacted by it. And it is really important to continue to pay attention to, the skies themselves and the information we get about the weather.
So how does, you mentioned The Long Winter, how does Laura's narrative in that book corroborate or build upon the
Yeah.
historical record, what actually happened? Oh, you froze, Barb.
That many blizzards, could it have lasted that long? And the origin story of this study is that one day I decided I wanted to go look it up because I'm a meteorologist and I'm a climatologist and I have the tools to do it. And I didn't really know what to expect about even what data I could find for the winter of 1880 to 1881, let alone how it would corroborate. But it became clear very quickly to me there were other stories that corroborated her account, other, historians who had documented things. And for what data I could find, and it isn't as much as we have now, but there were some observations out in the region. And from what I could find, it was every bit as nasty as she described. There were frequent snowfalls. It really did begin in October. It really didn't end until April. And I like saying this to my audiences that are not in South Dakota. People think of South Dakota as being pretty wintry, but October to April is pretty extreme even for South Dakota. It is not very common for winter to be nearly continuous for 6 straight months. Um, so the more I could find about how close her record actually was to what happened, just the more I wanted to know, not just what had happened to her, but what had happened to others in that winter too, and why it had the impact it did. And, there's just so many questions that get raised too about, well, have we had a winter like that since and it just didn't have the impact on us, or was that really a truly unique winter?
So alongside the Long Winter and that of what you speak, what other narratives does she provide in the books that corroborate actual weather or climate phenomena that you can actually pinpoint, say, oh, I know exactly what she's talking about?
There are several. In fact, it's more common than not, way more common than not, that if she has a specific weather-related event in her book, it happened. Her details may be a little different. She may have fictionalized some things, maybe about timelines, but the event itself is going to show itself somewhere. So one of the things that stuck out to me pretty quickly was in These Happy Golden Years, she and Almanzo are on a buggy ride together and witness a tornado forming and moving across the prairie. That was a specific tornado outbreak that is documented fairly well. And part of how it's documented really well is that one of the very first pictures of a tornado was taken near Howard, South Dakota, during that tornado outbreak. And the way Laura described the tornado, the location that she and Almanzo most likely were, it is very possible, very feasible that they in fact saw that very same tornado that's in the picture. So That to me is just one example of holy cow, like that is very, very real and tangible information. And for those who haven't seen the book yet, the picture of the tornado is in the book too, along with more about this description and this event. Grasshopper weather, the invasion of the Rocky Mountain locust was a very real phenomenon. Um, there's a cold air outbreak that she describes while she is riding with Almanzo to and from her very first school teaching assignment. That cold air outbreak is just as she described it, just in the right timing. There are just so many of these events that it's almost more startling to me. Well, not even almost, it's more startling to me when something in the weather doesn't match what she described.
Were you surprised by that to realize that, wow, that what's in the books actually tracks with what really happened? Were you
I think
surprised by that?
I think I expected to some extent that there would be similarities. I think I was surprised at just how consistently close to the records she was. Um, and when I thought about it a little more, it then started to make sense because, yeah, she didn't have the ability to go online and, look up, oh, what tornado was that I remember, and try to dig up the memory. It was imprinted in her memory, and she
Mhm.
probably retold stories about these big events through her life, right? She probably told them to her friends and neighbors when she moved on in adulthood. She probably told them to her own daughter. So repeating those stories time and time again, and the imprint that they probably made on her as a child and young woman, all of that probably sharpened her memory so that even though she wrote these books decades later, she wrote them um, from a place where the memories were ingrained.
Come on, sweetie. Come on, buddy.
Can I ask you all to mute your microphones, please? Thank you. So, does anybody? Let's pause here again before we move on to another part. Does anybody have any questions or comments, or who's a? Let me hear from a Laura Ingalls Wilder fan. How is this making sense to you? Okay, Dell has a question. Is weather today different from the 1880s? That's our next area to talk about, Dell. If it is the same, is the different impact results from better meteorology and technology?
Oh, so great of a question. No, things are not the same as they were in the 1880s. Our fundamental background climate has changed significantly. And that's really true across the globe. It's true across the United States. It's true in South Dakota and at all of her home sites where she lived when she was growing up, and which are the settings for her books. Not every place has exactly the same amount of change. Some places are changing more quickly than others, but every place has had changes in their weather patterns. And this is something I actually go into in some depth near the end of Wilder Weather, that if you want to seek the weather or the climate, the feeling as Laura experienced it at her home sites, it's not there anymore. What she felt when she lived in DeSmet is a little more like what somebody would feel these days in, say, Fargo. Um, those climates are becoming warmer, so the background becomes warmer, which means, yes, we still get cold air outbreaks, but if the climate is colder to start with, that cold air can really reach lower readings and last longer. When you have to cool down from that warmer background climate, that same amount of a cooling pattern can't bring the temperature down as much as it did in the past. So what that ends up resulting in is something that used to be the kind of cold air you'd get maybe every few years, maybe every decade, becomes something that you only experience maybe every generation or longer. Um, which means that we aren't as adapted to it anymore. If we were to experience winters like Laura did, we would find them to be quite cold. We would find them to be snowier than they are now.
So and this is just a personal curiosity thing. I have a niece who lives in Florida, and last winter she got snow and we didn't. So how do you explain that like, I'm sure people ask you, "Oh, you're a meteorologist. Tell me about this." So how would you explain such drastic changes, in like, especially within the last winter for all of us living here was fantastic if you ask me with a little snow, but my niece got it in Florida. So what gives?
Yeah, right. And then, even building on that, there was this big cold air outbreak in Texas a few winters ago
Yep.
that, was actually pretty devastating. It did a lot of damage to their infrastructure and caused quite a few fatalities. How can it possibly still get cold in the deep south when our climate is warming? And there are a couple of contributions to that. One of the contributions is that, remember, weather does still happen, right? We're still going to get cold outbreaks, even in a warming climate. So snow is not very common in Florida, but it's not unprecedented. Freezes are not very common in Texas, but it's not unprecedented. So part of it is simply that the ups and downs of weather that happen, that chaos and randomness in the system will still give us these extremes. And also, part of the fingerprint of climate change is not just that those averages move. Averages are all good and fine. They're a little easier to measure, but where we feel the weather and where it has the most impact on us is in the extremes, right? It isn't the average winters we remember. It's the very cold ones, the very warm ones, the very snowy or dry ones. And in a good number of places, it isn't so much the average that's changing as the range of possibilities. So they are experiencing both wetter and colder, or I'm sorry, both wetter and drier years, or both warmer and colder years as that chaos in the system amplifies. Um, so these are, there are very smart scientists doing the work, studying how all of these changes present themselves. And as climatologists, we often talk about those changes in the averages because it's just a quick number to grab onto. But in reality, the scope of the changes is so much more than that. It is in those extremes that we experience more or less often.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me how the weather, like what you do as a climatologist in terms of with these crazy weather years that we have, like, oh, okay, here's a curveball, not to use the baseball analogy, but it's fascinating to me. There's another question, a couple questions here in the chat. Gregory asks, I would like to hear about Dr. Boustead's initial exposures to Laura Ingalls Wilder. Furthermore, for me, learning about this historical accuracy enhances my appreciation of the author and her work. I wonder how Dr. Boustead's opinions about Laura and the Little House books has been impacted by her research.
Oh, thanks for that question. So, just as I found my way into meteorology by reading, thanks to my mom,
Hmm.
my mom also is the one who got me reading a Little House book. I was a pretty good reader as a kid, and my mom handed me this book that she had picked up from a garage sale. I was in first grade. It was going to be my first chapter book, and it had a picture on the cover of a couple little girls looking out the back of a wagon surrounded by prairie. It was Little House on the Prairie. And I kind of wrinkled my nose up at it and she said, just read it. I think you'll like it. And, moms are right. So I did. I loved it. And I started reading through that whole series, read them over and over as a kid, read them over and over even as an adult before I started studying them. But as I've gotten deeper into this academic side of studying Laura Ingalls Wilder's works and then interacted with other scholars who are doing research and writing books about Laura Ingalls Wilder, I think there are, I have a lot of respect for two things. First, the core of her historical fiction, where she is recalling that history and remembers things when it's part of her story, remembers things really well and tells a very realistic and compelling story. I also have a lot of respect for her ability to craft a story, a narrative, because these are fiction. And sometimes as a writer, you need to make those choices about characters or timelines or plot that are not a part of the true historical record in order to move a story along, make things engaging, communicate things to kids. And I think she also was really deft at how she crafted her stories. So um, I have a lot of respect for the work that she did. I understand too, there's a lot of concern and problematic language throughout the books that I think a lot of scholars have also addressed well. Caroline Fraser, in particular, with Prairie Fires, did a really good job putting Laura Ingalls Wilder's life into the cultural and historical context around her. And I think that's a really important part of the story too.
Thank you for that. Another question is from K.E. Land. It's I'm excited about the potential of using your work to get different folks, especially people who are experiencing climate change in their communities but don't have a way to voice their concerns, talking about climate change. How are you using your book to get the conversation going? I'm a big fan of Katharine Hayhoe and her push to get the conversation going. Are you familiar with hashtag Show Your Stripes? This seems to relate to your book and work as well, showing the changes.
Oh, absolutely. I almost wore my Show My Stripes necklace. This. I love Show Your Stripes because it is a very visually compelling way to tell the story of how things are changing and how abrupt that change has been, and how the changes look different from place to place, but doesn't negate the story of changes in one place just because someplace else doesn't look like that. So I think that's compelling. I also am a big fan of Katharine Hayhoe. She is science communicator extraordinaire and does a very good job bringing respectful discussion and empathy and kindness and hope about climate into the conversation. I especially appreciate her messages of hope, because the messages about climate change can be overwhelming, and in fact, so overwhelming that there is a school of thought out there for some folks that it's too much. We're too late. We can't do anything. So, forget it. Let's just jump off a cliff. Um, and I think it's really important to keep our hope alive because um, I think it is Catherine who said this. Gosh, I hope that humans are the ones driving climate change because if human activities caused it, that means human activity can also curb it. So it gives us hope that there are solutions in the world. And that's a really important part of the message. And I also share your hope that this book is a tool, a device for communicating about climate change to some folks who maybe aren't really in that discussion yet. Because if you've got that common interest or language with somebody, which in Laura Ingalls Wilder, you have that commonality in a lot of people, that opens the door to talking about something as simple as things were different in Laura's time than they are now. Um, and that simple observation is the start of putting climate change in context without ever using the words if you don't want to. And also to understand that just as Laura and her family had to adapt to new climates as they moved, we will have to adapt to new climates, not because we're moving, but because they're moving to us.
Mhm. Interesting. I wanted to point out, I don't know if everybody on the call has read our one book, South Dakota, this year by Rebecca Clarence called The Cost of Free Land. And when I was reading that, I was simultaneously reading your book, and they're written about the same time, the late 1800s. And so then I was sitting there thinking about the weather in her book in relation to what you're saying, and I'm like, oh, Laura wrote about that. So it was just really interesting that weather seems to be like the talk of everything at that time because it was so dramatically different than it is now. It impacted everything in a much different way. So, how invaluable are Laura's recollections in her narratives to the measuring and documenting of weather and climate change over time, and in what ways?
I'm going to use another analogy here. And I mentioned earlier, that I had been curious what weather records I would find for 1880 to 1881 because they were pretty few and far between. Those weather records are important because they are written, documented, quality controlled, and archived for safekeeping. Um, and I like to think of them as the bones of a dinosaur we're digging up, right? The climate record, as measured by instruments, is that skeleton. And we can use those to reconstruct the past. We can put that skeleton together and tell a bit about that dinosaur. Um, in the dinosaur world, right? We can tell how big it was, maybe that it was a plant eater versus a meat eater. We might even be able to tell a little bit about how it reproduced or whether it, preferred to run or walk. What Laura's stories do, and other narratives like hers, other personal accounts, written accounts, what they do is put more of the dinosaur together for us because the skeleton gives us that shape and an overall structure. but it doesn't tell us what color the dinosaur was. It doesn't tell us what it sounded like. Um, there's so much more to what that dinosaur was than just its skeleton. And Laura's stories like that, they flesh out the story of what happened that winter. We can look back at those records and see it was cold, there was a lot of precipitation. What Laura's stories do is tell us what the impact was to the people who lived there and what that lived experience felt like. Because even two very severe winters don't have the same impact. Laura actually experienced another winter that was just about as severe as the long winter, but it's not really that big of a part of her narrative. A little bit. She mentions a little bit of blizzardy weather and on the banks of Plum Creek, but that winter actually was very, very cold, colder than the long winter, and ranks as one of the most extreme ever in, where she was living up in Minnesota. So why wasn't that the long winter of her story? Well, its impact was different. Maybe because it was less snow, so the trains could keep running. Maybe because they were near a town and that town had been there longer, so it had better resources. Um, we can speculate quite a bit about what it was about that winter that made it not so impactful to her, but we have her stories, so we do know that not only the long winter happened by the records, but it was life-changing to people who experienced it.
So, what are some common misconceptions that people have today about weather and climate? And how do you debunk those? Set us straight, Barb.
Oh, the list is long but distinguished. And for those who really do want to understand and debunk climate myths, there's some good information out there in the world. Um, and the best way to debunk information is to just speak the truth over and over, even before the myth stuff gets out there. Um, I think one of the biggest ones we face is when something, when we get a cold spell. There's a famous speech by a senator who, it snowed in DC and he brought in a snowball and said, I've got your climate change right here. Well, yeah, it snows in DC. Like it's still winter, even if climate is changing. So it's important to remember that climate influences the weather patterns. Climate change is one of those influences, and sometimes a pretty strong one, but sometimes not. Sometimes it's not the biggest nudger in the weather that occurs. Um, so I think it's important to both understand how climate can influence our weather, but also that what happens with any one weather event does not itself dictate climate, that you really do have to complete the story with all of the patterns and influences. And there are some scientists who are getting very good at actually putting numbers to it and saying, for this particular, let's say, heavy rainfall event, this is 10% more moisture because of climate change. So, you know, this would have been, 10% less severe. Maybe we would have gotten 5 inches instead of 6. Would there still have been a flood? Probably. Would it have been less intense? Probably.
So, what are the most valuable or important lessons we can learn from Laura Ingalls Wilder's weather observations?
The most important is that she observed it, that she paid attention, right? That she looked for the signs, the best that she had at the time. Now, lucky us, we don't have to look for a cloud in the northwest to know a blizzard is coming. We have forecasts and warnings that do that for us, but we still have to be tuned in and get them. We still have to respond to them in an appropriate way to take protective actions for ourselves. So when I say, that we're paying attention to the weather, it's partly, simply us, just look at what's happening around you and also, take those protective measures to ensure your safety and the safety of your family, and in some cases, the safety of your community. Um, I also think part of what Laura teaches us is that importance of community, that helping each other out when things are hard. Um, During the long winter, they pooled food together to make sure there was enough. What an amazing thing for the whole town to get together and say, well, who really needs more wheat and who has other stuff so that they don't go hungry? Um, I think that's a really great example that, we could perhaps consider in our lives now. And I think too, Laura was a lifelong learner and observer. She paid attention as a child, probably because she was describing things around her for her blind sister Mary. Um, but she continued to do that as an adult. She still paid attention to things. She still observed the weather. She wrote about the weather pretty routinely in her letters to her daughter Rose, um, and continued to engage and try to make lives better. She took jobs that involved farm loans and trying to make sure that folks could get the financial support they needed, for example. So um, there's so much to learn, I think, but those are some of the biggest lessons I think we can take directly from her actions. And for ourselves to be able to look back at the past in order to understand now and the future, and that things really are changing. And it's not just because, we live in this volatile place. We do live in a volatile weather place, but the volatility is changing too.
There's another question here for you. I would suggest getting the word to school librarians out about your book, especially high school librarians. I know many teachers who will be interested in your work. I absolutely agree. I think this is one of those must-read type of books, because when you were speaking about, what we can learn from Laura about the weather and everything, there's also a lot to read, to learn from her books and from your book too, about community and about, empathy. And we literally are all into this together. We're not getting out of this separately. We have to do this as a community. Does anybody else have any questions? We'll take one little question break right here, and we'll move on to some more interesting introspection for Barb.
I'll reflect on that comment too for just
Okay.
while folks maybe are gathering their thoughts on a question that I think teachers are a fantastic place to get words like this out. And I have done engagement with teachers for a long time in this space, because that ability to put together literature, history, and science is kind of a boon for teachers who are looking to help their students connect to the material that they're teaching. Middle school teachers are especially interested in this too. It's right around when the readership of Laura Ingalls Wilder maybe is peaking and their engagement in science is also increasing. So there's a really nice overlap there that works out pretty well. So yes, I can do some things to get the word out, but I also rely on folks like you to talk to your school librarians, tell them about this book, and let them know they can pick up a copy from the South Dakota Historical Society Press and put it in the library.
And I did put a link in the chat so you can find Barb's book and purchase a copy. And I did put links to her Facebook and her Substack page, her blog on Substack. Katie says, what is your favorite Laura Ingalls Wilder book and why?
Katie, it's going to be super predictable, but the long winter, because there is so much weather to it, but also because literarily, the narrative arc of that book is particularly compelling. Some of her books kind of read as this happened, then this happened. There's a little growth through them, but they're sort of just, a year in the life of type of stories. This really is a compelling, there's conflict, family versus nature, there's resolution, there's, near-death experiences, and so it's both the weather side, but also the literature side that makes me really enjoy that book.
So turning then to the Barb Boustead piece of this book, in this process, what, if anything, has changed since you completed this book?
I have gotten busy.
That's a good thing, though, right?
This book, like I said, represents the culmination of a good 15 or so years of work. And you would think that publishing the book means, okay, finally, I've got this project done and I can move on to something else. But this is only the start, because now it becomes showing people how this book can help them understand the weather and climate around them and can help them relate to others as well. That they can use that common story of Laura Ingalls Wilder to discuss weather and climate with people they care about. So I am still writing articles about this. I'm still learning new information about Laura and her weather. And I am still, I'm actively looking for opportunities to tell more people about this, to go speak at, different organizations or groups that may have a connection to any of the above, weather, climate, or Laura Ingalls Wilder, so that they can, also communicate these messages and reach folks. Where do I go from here? Anywhere I'm invited. Thanks. But especially to the Festival of Books next month, which I am really excited to be attending. Not only because I get to talk about my own work, but because there are so many awesome authors that are going to be there and I get to see their works.
It's going to be pretty exciting. I'm really looking forward to it too. There's so many books to read though. Like there's how do we get them all in? But that's a whole nother I digress here. Um, so in regard to this summer, actually this whole past year, the weather's been remarkably volatile throughout the country. What goes into a weather forecast then when things are like this? How do you put together a weather forecast? How can we better be prepared to understand the components and then protect what we hold most dear?
And this has really the last few years have been quite volatile.
Yeah.
We've had summers where all you see are milky skies because the wildfires have spread smoke overhead for weeks on end. We've had very warm winters, very dry winters. We've had a couple snowy ones. That volatility, as I mentioned, is a part of what we anticipate. So, event by event on a weather forecast, how do we understand what's coming and communicate about it? It starts with the observations that we have of the weather conditions, which is everything from those instruments that are measuring temperature and precipitation and winds. It also includes satellites. It's more than just clouds that we get from satellites. We can also get information about where the clouds might be ready to produce lightning, which is important for letting people know. For instance, if you've got a state fair going on, which I believe South Dakota does starting this weekend, um, there's somebody at the Weather Service office whose job it is to monitor that area for the interest of public safety. And if they see the potential for lightning, they will notify your county's emergency managers so that they can move people into places of safety or start to take the actions they need to take to cancel or postpone outdoors events. Um, so that is all part of observing the weather. It's radar too. And then computer models take that information, use a whole bunch of math and physics equations, and process them to interpret what can happen in the future. And it's not just one model that does that and we take its solution and run with it. There are dozens of models that will do this, and the meteorologists interpret not just one output, but the whole range of outputs to understand the possibilities. So when you get a temperature forecast that says 85 degrees, what that really means is 85 is the most likely temperature, but it's kind of in a range from 82 to 88. Or it could mean, well, there's a cold front on its way. So it's either going to be 85 or 72, depending on when that front comes through. But we're going to take a guess on one and think that this is the most likely outcome. There are some patterns that are more predictable than others. And frontal passages are notorious for that, right? We know the front's coming, but the timing of it can really affect what you feel that day. Rain and precipitation are harder to forecast than temperatures because there's more that goes into it, right? You have to understand not just what the temperature is, but the moisture, not just at the ground, but all the way up in the atmosphere, and what might be forcing it to become a shower or won't force it to become a shower that day. So there are so many layers of information that go into it. And on top of all of that, this all is built on the research that's been done for decades and centuries to understand how the weather works. That's scientists who have been studying for a long time, everything from the chemistry of the atmosphere to the behavior of storm systems to very close up forecasts of tornadoes. All of that research continues to build on itself to better understand what we know and what we don't know about the specifics of weather. Forecasts right now are very good. I know people like to rip on meteorologists, but a 7-day forecast now is as good as a 3-day forecast was about 20 years ago, right? We are much more skilled than we used to be at those forecasts. But because of chaos and randomness, there are still things that happen. There are things that are in the range of possibilities, but weren't the most likely outcome, so they didn't get communicated. So some of that kind of happens in the system too.
Thank you for that explanation. So in terms of this book, what was the most challenging thing about writing it?
I'll be perfectly honest. I love writing. I love weather. I love climate. I like talking about Laura Ingalls Wilder. Um, I am a full-time worker and the parent of a very active kid. Simply finding time was probably the hardest part of writing this book for me. It is wonderful to get, a week or a weekend when you can just really sink in and concentrate on writing when you're a writer. But reality is most of this was written in half-hour chunks. I'd get done with my workday, close up one laptop, open the other one, and write for a while before I turned myself off and went down to my family for the rest of the day. And I think as a writer, I think it's important to communicate that, writing isn't necessarily going and sitting in the remote cabin and typing with a view of a pond out your window. It's squeezing that writing into the cracks. It's, getting the urge to say something because you have something to say that you think is important and putting it down on paper, come back to it later, fix it, come back to it later, polish it up, come back to it later and publish it and build those pieces bit by bit because very few writers are actually just writing alone. And for the rest of us who have other obligations in our lives, we do squeeze that in. But on the weather side, on the climate side, putting this research together has been a joy. Writing the stories of it has been a joy. And organizing it into a book sometimes is hard, but I had very good book coaches who helped me put the story together.
I was just going to ask you what the most rewarding part of what was writing this book.
Oh, it has always been, from the time this was just research and ideas in my head, it has always been when I get to talk to people about it and get their questions. I love getting people's questions and answering them and sparking curiosity, getting people to think, about something just a little more than in passing. Everybody talks about the weather, right? We all love to talk about the weather, but we don't often really deeply think about it. So I love getting that conversation going.
So what do you most hope readers will take away from this book?
I hope they will take away that they do have that power and ability to keep themselves, their families, and the things they cherish, their loved ones, more protected. We can't prevent the storms from coming at us, but we can take those actions ourselves to learn from the past, to understand what those possibilities are, to prepare ourselves in advance, and to take the actions when that threat arrives. So we're in a place where we can better adapt to what is going to happen to us.
I think even just looking back up on this, from today's perspective and looking back, we are so fortunate that we have, people like you and other meteorologists and climatologists that can tell us, hey, watch for shelf cloud. There's the weather's going to be a little wonky today. So they didn't have that, and like I think about that and just I'm from the East Coast, so we have a lot of people there don't sometimes understand that a tornado just drops down out of the sky. But we know that the because of what the work that you guys do, that it's a possibility. Back in Laura's day, they didn't have any idea. So we've come a long way for sure.
Exactly.
So I'm gonna build off of Dell's question in the chat. He said, where do you go from here? What are your future projects or writing aspirations, or where's Barb thinking?
I do think I'm going to be writing related to this topic for the rest of my life. But it isn't the only thing I have to say. So Yes, will I write again? Will I do more about weather or other things? Probably. I have some ideas that bubble around about, everything from more of my up close experiences with weather to, you know, actions that folks can take to empower themselves and have hope for climate in the future, and um, some of the stories of how people have been impacted by both weather and climate, myself or others. I think all of those are good stories to tell. We'll see what shape they take in the future, but I do hope to keep writing and getting some of this out to the world and getting those conversations started with people.
Are you working on anything currently? Or do you do you have little bubbles of ideas already forming?
I do have bubbles of ideas, but they're not ready to see the daylight yet. In the meantime, though, I continue to write newsletter articles and other little pieces related to this work. And I have actually published an article or two that are not at all related to weather and climate. I have an essay in the anthology Awakenings, published last year, Stories of Body and Consciousness, which was more of a health and our experiences in our own bodies. So I do other things too, I suppose, but this is definitely where my heart is.
Well, you mentioned that you work full time. Tell everybody what you do. I think it's fascinating.
So I do work for a federal agency. I work for NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and um, what I do is in a little bit of flux. I have worked in the past as a weather forecaster, as a climate program manager, as an instructor doing some of the teaching that we do within the Weather Service to train our meteorologists on how to do their work. I have currently been working more on helping to understand and coordinate our abilities in NOAA to address some of that most impactful sort of weather to climate type of hazards, like heat, for instance, drought, wildfire, floods, some of those areas where a lot of parts of NOAA are doing work in those areas, and we want to do our best to support that work and be good stewards of resources and continue to support our ability to help communities keep themselves safe and help individuals keep themselves safe.
I think I speak collectively for all of us when I say thank you for the work you do, because what you do also helps us keep our, along with, learning about the weather, which is the subject of your book, we learn it through you. So thank you for what you do. It's been a delight to talk to you. I can't wait to meet you in Spearfish. We are out of time. We're right up against that 1 o'clock mark here. I want to welcome everybody back again next week. We're going to continue weekly until the festival at the end of September. Next week we'll have Rebecca Claren with us, and she'll be talking about the book I mentioned earlier. It's called The Cost of Free Land. It is The Cost of Free Land. It's right actually here. Jews, Lakota, and an American Inheritance. It's the 2025 one book for South Dakota. And I think if you read it, you'll find a lot of similar themes with the Little House books, and it's just such a good book. So I'm excited to talk to Rebecca next week. I hope you guys can all join us. And I also hope that you'll be able to join us in a Spearfish for the festival. If not, check out our website, because we will be live streaming and offering recordings of some of the sessions that we'll have at the festival this year. So we got everybody in mind. So anyway, thank you so much. It's time for everybody to be done with their lunch break. So I guess it's time to go. Thanks so much for joining us. Thank you, Barb, for joining us. And everybody have a great weekend. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.